fancy. All right, everybody. My name is Jackie Lebouitz. I am studying environmental studies and biology at New College of Florida, and I've been working with Selby Gardens since last summer on a couple different projects, some of which are field inventories, data entry, and a species guide for toxic plants in Southwest Florida. So the first project and the primary focus of Selby was to figure out how to model phenological patterns using data on epiphytes from the digitized Selby herbarium. And right there in the corner we have a beautiful mature tillandsia. So it's important to talk about what phenology is before we delve into this any further. So to put it in simple terms, it's how time can affect different natural cycles. To illustrate it in a little more depth, though, it's about seasons and climate and the different morphological variations that occur in a plant over time. So fruiting and flowering. A seasonal example could be a field of flowers covered in snow. Suddenly the sun comes out, it's spring, and those flowers come out from under the snow and bloom. It's important to examine phenological patterns in plants because with changing climate, there's a lot that could go wrong, especially in regards to phenological mismatch. So one example that I wanted to use to illustrate that concept was pollinators and plants. So you could have a wildflower that comes out after a cold winter, and if that winter is especially cold and it's just a little off, the pollinator might be confused and waste some energy trying to find it when it's not ready to emerge. Other examples of phenology in practice are the falling of leaves and the production of fruit. Phenology is important because not only does it allow us to make important observations about the cyclical nature of plants, but to also track changes over time in the face of, like I said, climate change. On that note, a little bit more about the project that I was working on in particular. So it was to investigate the little-known cycles of epiphytic species, in particular bromeliads, throughout Florida by using this online software that Lily talked about briefly called CERNEC. And we have these digitized specimens for Selby on CERNEC that have these fields that you can populate about the different phenological observations that you can make. Here are some typical examples of the different phenophases or points in the phenological patterns that you can observe for different bromeliad species. So on the far left we have a sterile specimen, so it doesn't have any reproductive structures yet. And then you can see it's starting to bud on the right, and then it produces a flower. Afterwards you get these formations of seed pods, which eventually mature and release seeds. We also use this process called Geo Referencing to figure out exactly where these different plants occurred on a map. So there are a couple questions to keep in mind when thinking about phenology of epiphytes. One of them is, are herbarium collections useful records of phenology? And the second is, do epiphytes show seasonal patterns in Florida specifically? So with those questions in mind, I figured now would be a good time to present some of the challenges that I faced trying to figure out exactly what stage a certain specimen was in when looking through the digitized herbariums. Unfortunately, because a lot of these specimens are old, dating back to the 1970s even, the specimens can be crushed or a little damaged or too dried out. And they were digitized just recently, so some of the data can be misinterpreted. And then I have some examples of some confusing specimens that I ran into. However, it's really important to have that data accessible through the online herbariums because it lets us see a snapshot of phenology in times that we weren't actively looking to make those connections between climate and flowering and fruiting. So ultimately, the collection and consolidation of this data is one of the best resources we have in determining trends. So here is one of the fields that kind of represents the work that I was doing through CERNAC. And there's a lot of different categories, and it continues on to another page. But among the things that I was looking to do was to catalog the different phenologies. So whether it was budding, or if it had a flower, or fruit, or mature fruit, and then figuring out its location on the map. And then on the left, we have a little picture of some past Selby interns who were digitizing the older collections. One of the products of this research was creating a map through ArcGIS, in which the different phenological patterns are kind of cataloged overall for bromeliad species. And you can kind of see where they're distributed in Florida and what they're going through. But unfortunately, this doesn't really examine the seasonality of it. So therefore, we have this chart that was generated through RStudio that kind of tracks what was happening to the members of Bromeliaceae over the course of different seasons. And in some ways, the data that came out of this was good. For instance, you can kind of expect to see mature fruit happening at the end of winter, and flowering is fairly common around February. So there were some trends that were observable from the output. However, there were a lot of things that were a bit iffy, and it's just a matter of, I think, tidying up the data and figuring out how to sort through it in the future and what fields to add and to change, as well as just there is an unavailability of data during a certain time period as well. So then we move on to the second project, which I've been starting to work on this semester, which is creating a field guide for toxic plants in Southwest Florida. It started off at the Toxicity Lima Reserve, and I went out with the Selby team last summer on a couple different trips trying to figure out what plants were where and whether there were any harmful toxic plants or invasives and important natives to keep track of. And so we went out, we picked some plants that we felt were relevant and needed to be vouchered, and we would label them and take pictures of labels next to plants that we kept in the ground, and then we'd write in some different documents and then put them in bags, dry them out, and then put them in the herbarium if they didn't exist there already. And just a fun little aside, there's a golden silk orb weaver. We had a lot of those when we went out there. They're giant and beautiful. But the main goal with this whole project was to figure out, what sorts of plants were in the enclosure, and to relay that information to the folks at the Lima Reserve so that they could best figure out what sort of management strategies to employ. So when taking that inventory turned into creating a guide, there were a lot of things that I wanted to focus on. Primarily, it ended up being toxicity and toxic plants in Southwest Florida. So toxicity is kind of troublesome to define in a lot of ways, because what is harmful to an animal, might not be harmful to us. And then there are minor forms of toxicity like dermatitis, where it's a skin rash and it's not something exactly worth cataloging in a field guide where you only have limited space. So then there was also the matter of writing the descriptions and figuring out exactly what to include in the descriptions. So some of what we determined would work out best is the country of origin, whether the species were invasive, some of the physical features, and ecological information, so where you would find those plants. And then we employed the use of 3 different Selby databases to figure out which pictures are the most high quality to use and to showcase the different features of each in a way that looked clean, and then we'd retouch them through Photoshop. This is an example of the preliminary guide we were working on, which shows Florida tick seed, and we've made a lot of steps to clean it up and make it look different based on the Chicago's Field Museum standards. They have a whole database of field guides on their website. But yeah, we had some categories like whether it was toxic, native, invasive, or considered a browse food by the lemurs. So lemurs like to eat a lot of things like mango and guava and grapes. And yes. Any questions?